In this video, I'm going to show you how to configure dependent fields in a screen. So here I have a simple screen. It just allows you to first select the country, and then based on the country you select, it's going to display the regions of that country. All right, so the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to configure this select list control. So first of all, I'm getting the values for the countries from a call to an API endpoint. It's an open endpoint that just shows me the countries. So first, let me show you the configuration of that particular data connector, and then I'll come back to the select list and show you the configuration for that. So here is the configuration of the data connector I'm using to input that list of countries into the select list control. So here I just have the name, description, and category, nothing too complicated there. For the authorization, because it's an open API, I did not require any API tokens or authentication. So then here I have the endpoints associated to this data connector. So the one I'm using here is this first one called list. So if I expand the configuration here, I can see the purpose, which is list, and then the method I'm using is simply the get method because I'm trying to get information in the response. And then here is the URL. Again, this is an open API that is free to use for anyone, so feel free to use it yourself. Now, if I look into the rest of the configuration, I didn't need any request headers. That's actually part of another configuration I had before, but I don't need any request headers for this endpoint. I don't need a request body, and then of course no sample data because I didn't need to send a request body. So then here, if I test this data connector, I see the JSON object from the response, and you can see here I get the names of all the countries as well as their ISO codes. And this is going to come in very important for me when I go to configure the select list control. So now let's go back into the screen and I'll show you how to configure the select list control. So here I just have the variable that's going to store the country that I select, plus the label of the field there. But what I'm really looking for is this data source. So of course, in this data source, I'm using a data connector to populate the options in this dropdown. So that's why I'm selecting the data source here as the data connector. I'm rendering the options in a dropdown, as you saw earlier in the preview. And then here I'm selecting the data connector I want to use. So this dropdown automatically pulls the values or pulls the data connectors that exist in your environment. So the data connector I just was showing you is called Call Countries API. So I selected that data connector here. And then in this endpoint dropdown, it's automatically going to be populated with the endpoints associated to that data connector. So I had two for that one. I had the list here, and then also a get record one, but I'm just going to use the list endpoint, which is the one I just showed you. Finally, I have the element name. So this is where the response object comes in very important, is to be able to configure the select list to pull those options from that JSON object. So that's what I'm doing here in the next three fields with the element name, value, and content. So let me start with the element name. So the element name is going to be the name of the entire response body that you get from that call. So when you're calling any API, when you're calling any endpoint from ProcessMaker, that array where that object is stored is always going to be called response. So here I just left response there. So that's always going to be response. But because what I'm looking for is not stored within, or it's not nested within another array, I can go right away and just use the key names here. So the key names I wanted to use were the name of the country and then the Alpha 2 code. So what I did is, taking a look at this key name here, which is just name, I'm going to enter that into the content field here. So the content field are the labels that you see appear in the dropdown. So if I look in the preview again, you can see here that I see all of the names of the country, and that is coming from that name key from that response object there. So then if we take a look at this value field, this is the value that's going to be stored after I select the country. So this is what ProcessMaker is going to store as that variable value, which is country. So if I take a look again at that response object, you can see here that key name is Alpha 2 code. So I entered that from the response object into the value field here. So then when I go into the preview, um, if I select a country, so like Argentina, and I look at the data preview in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you can see here with that country key name, I have the value, which is that Alpha 2 code I get from the response. All right. So that's how you configure the select list control to pull values from that response object and then store those values in a ProcessMaker variable. So the next thing I needed to do was figure out how to populate this region dropdown with all of the states and provinces in the country I selected. So that's what I'm talking about when I say dependent fields, is that the values or the options in this dropdown depend on the country selected in this first dropdown. So how do I create that dependency? That really depends on the endpoints that you call. They should already have that dependency there. So what I did was I used the ISO code that I stored in this country variable for that country dropdown, and I used it as a path parameter in another endpoint that retrieves the regions of each country. So let me first show you how I configured that data connector. So I'm going to use a different data connector for this one. And this one is going to be called Get Regions. So I'm going to take a look at the configuration there. So here I have those basic details. I have the authorization method. This one did require authentication, but I'm sending that authentication in the header. So I just selected no authentication here for that method. And then here I have the endpoint that I'm using. So you can see here already in that URL, I require a path parameter. So that path parameter is the country's ISO code. So the thing to take note here is, because I'm using a ProcessMaker variable to populate that path parameter, I'm putting the name of my ProcessMaker variable within mustache syntax in the endpoint URL. So you can see here I have that path parameter there in the endpoint URL, and that's coming from that drop-down that I just showed you how to configure. So you see here that variable name is country. So I'm using this variable to populate the path parameter here in the so I can call this endpoint and get the regions in the country I selected. So that's how I'm able to create that, get that dependency working there. Now, like I said before, I required a token to be able to use this particular endpoint. So I put the authorization I needed in the request header. So this is all the information I got from the application where I'm calling this endpoint. So I had to sign up for an account, and then they gave me the keys and values I needed to be able to call this endpoint. So these request headers and the authentication method really depend on how the external application has that set up for you. So in this case, I needed to add my authentication to the request headers for this particular endpoint. Um, so in this case, I also don't need to send anything with the request body um, because I'm just getting information, and I also don't need the sample data. So this is what the endpoint configuration for the second dropdown looks like. The thing to keep in mind is just this path parameter here, which I have populated by a ProcessMaker variable. And then, of course, I had to put that variable in mustache syntax, so it's automatically populated. All right, so that brings me back to this screen. So the next thing I needed to configure was a watcher. So what this watcher does is when I select a country from the country dropdown, this watcher runs. It's going to make the call to that endpoint using the data connector. And then after the watcher finishes running, I'll have that response object that will populate the region dropdown. So basically what watchers do is they watch a variable value, in this case, the variable country. And then once I select the country, it's going to populate that path parameter. Then it's going to get the regions from the country I selected and populate it into the select list. So now let me just show you that watcher configuration here. So I'm going to just go in and edit it. I have the watcher name, which is just get region. And then, of course, the variable to watch is that country variable. Here I had this toggled to run synchronously just because I just want to wait for the watcher to run before they can play with that dropdown. All right, so then the important part of this configuration is going to be the source. So the source here, I can select between data connectors and scripts. So because I'm using the data connector, I'm going to input that data connector I just showed you into this drop down here. So it's going to be get regions is the drop down, or sorry, is the data connector I was using. There's only one endpoint, which is list. And then here, this input data is very important because this is what is allowing me to pass that variable to the endpoint, that API call there. So here I have the name of the variable from ProcessMaker in mustache syntax. And then the key name, which is going to populate that path parameter, is country. So this is in JSON format. So if you're familiar with JSON format, I have the key name here, which is country, and that key name needs to match the path parameter name here. And then the value of that key is going to come from the country variable. So I've just for convenience, I named all of these things the same thing. But if I wanted to, just to show you the difference and drive that point home, if I name this country one here, then it's going to have to come from this country one variable. So that's the connection there. So that value that I just put in that JSON object is coming from the variable from the screen. And let me undo that, otherwise it will break. And then here, this key name needs to match the path parameter. So that's how that is configured there and the reasons why. So I've got my source and input data. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just store that response object in a variable that my screen can access. So that output variable is going to be called regions. And that regions variable is just going to store that entire response object I get back from that data connector. So let me just show you that response object that I'm looking for. So to test this out, I'm just going to, I guess, put in US as the country code for now. And then let me just test it here. So here is the response object. So this is the object that's going to be stored in that regions variable I put in the output configuration for the watcher. So it's all here nested in a data array, and this is going to come in very important when I configure that select list control. So I have the country code here, and then the ISO code. So basically, what I'm looking for is the name of the states or provinces in the country. So I'm looking at the name here, Delaware, Alaska, which I recognize as states of the US. Because this is a free API, it only returns 5 values, but if you have an API that returns all of the states in a country the same, you would configure it in the same way, basically. All right. So here I have my response object. So now let me go back. And so that entire response object is going to be stored in the regions variable. So let me just show you that again in the output regions, because this is going to come in very important for the region select list configuration. All right. So here I have region, I have the variable name that's going to store the region I select, and then the label here. Same configuration for pretty much any input control. And then in the data source, I'm looking at request data this time because it's coming from a watcher. So again, I'm going to run that watcher, and then it's going to output that variable regions, and then regions is going to store that response object. So the important thing here is I'm selecting request data as the data source this time, not data connector. And then finally, down in element name, this is also very important. So you can see here, first I call the name of that variable that stores the response object, which is regions. So that's what I am doing here is I have the name of that output variable first. And then like I mentioned before in this video, every response that you get from a call to an endpoint from ProcessMaker is going to be stored in an array called response. So that's why I have response appended here. And then if we look at the response object, we saw that it was nested in an array called data. So then that's why I appended data here. So here again is that data array that has all of the information I'm looking for about each state. So that's why I put that at the end of that element name here. All right, and then finally I have the value and the content, which I use that key name I got from the response object there, which stores the name of the states in the US. And this time I just had the label of each of those options and the value stored in the variable be the exact same value. All right, so that's the configuration of these two dependent fields. So now if let me change this back to that path parameter. I'm actually just going to cancel out of here. So those changes aren't saved, and then I'm going to preview this. So here I'm going to select a country. So I'll just select the US again. That watcher is going to run, and then this region drop down is populated with the states returned by that call. And then if you want to see here to make sure that the watcher is working correctly, if you look at the data preview, if the watcher runs correctly, you're going to see that variable value that we selected as the output variable for the watcher, that's going to be populated with the response object returned by that call. So you can see here I have the regions variable, which is populated by the response I got. So we can see here it was successful because it has a code of 200. And then you can see here, this is why we always use that response in that element name field, is because that response is always going to be stored in this response object. And then here is data. So we can see here the format of that element name field was, remember, it was regions.response.data. So that's where that comes from. So let me just show that to you again. Element name, regions.response.data, and that's coming from that response object. So I'm going to show that again. Come on, watcher. Okay, this time for Tonga. And then we look at it, regions, response.data. And so that's how you know your watcher is working correctly, and that's how you know how to populate that second select list control with values from that object. So that's how you configure those dependent fields. I hope this video came in useful.